Presbyterian missionary work in Congo is a very large subject, carried out by many very dedicated people, women and men, African or Caucasian or later Asian heritage. This brief presentation is not a full account. It concentrates mainly on two aspects: an overview of the ways that mission policy was related to colonial mentality and powers. 2, the experience of African American missionaries with the sending church and with their white colleagues before 1960. It includes a few words on missionaries' attitudes toward Congolese and some of the changes beginning to be visible in the mid-20th century. Part 1. King Leopold II of Belgium carved out an enormous personal fiefdom in Central Africa, which he ruled from 1885 until 1908 under the incongruous name of the Congo Free State. Various businesses, such as the Compagnie du Kassai, exploited the land for the king. They routinely employed Africans to compel other Africans to harvest the prized natural resources. The most famous example of this was the use of the Zappo-Zaps to enforce rubber collection, with the penalty of chopping off the right hands of those who did not supply the demanded quota. It was the work of a number of people, but most strikingly William Shepherd, to expose this human trafficking. The missionaries clearly set the primary blame on the Europeans, not their African subordinates, and the internationally published scandal led to the Congo Free State being turned over to Belgium as a colony in 1908. The early APCM had maintained a distance from King Leopold's agents and supported Shepherd's exposé. The negative effects of this publicity storm created by missionaries, led by an African American, made relations between the mission and Belgium worse. One area where these relations can be tracked is in educational policy. The government favored Roman Catholic missions, but felt compelled to tolerate Protestants for fear of international protest. Roman Catholic schools received subsidies, and their diplomas were recognized. Protestants got neither, and their graduates suffered because they could not get comparable jobs. A key educational issue was the choice of language. Belgians preferred to use a small number of Bantu languages and rejected the idea of teaching Africans French. To promote and control and facilitate communication, the colonial rulers used only Chuluba in the Kasai. The African American missionaries, who worked primarily in the Cuba area, wrote down and studied that language and produced early literature in it. The main educational plan of the APCM was to establish schools in Chuluba, a decision which aligned very closely with Belgian policy. This was partly simply practical. Trying to produce literature in several Bantu languages would require considerably more work and expense. However, internal to the mission, the conflict over languages was also racially inflected, with the dominant white position squeezing out the African American interest in the Cuba language. In the 1930s, and especially after World War II, the colonial power became less hostile to Protestants. The new party in power in Brussels rejected the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church and began to treat Protestant schools the same as the Catholic ones. Secondary education in French was approved. The government also started to require all missionaries to spend a year of study in Belgium before going to Congo. Parallel to these changes, Presbyterians also drew back from their earlier, more critical stance. The point here is that the relationships between the American missionaries and the rulers of the Congo changed over the course of time. This is particularly marked in the attitudes of the Brussels government toward African American missionaries, whom they regarded with suspicion from the time of Shepherd's trial on. This distrust increased as a result of their fear of the international spread of Marcus Garvey's movement in the 1920s. And by 1922, the colonial power refused to allow any more African Americans to be appointed. When Alonzo Edmiston retired in 1941, for the first time in 50 years, there were no African American Presbyterians in Congo, and no more were admitted until 1958. The white church leadership in the U.S. and the white missionaries accepted the Belgian policies without protest. They shared the underlying racist principles. Part 2. Both African American and white missionaries were deeply convinced of the gospel they felt called to bring to the Congolese. Both women and men demonstrated a devotion which led them through sickness and trials of many kinds, and for a significant number to early graves. However, for the African Americans, there were more and different hurdles to overcome or negative attitudes to endure. The most basic was the issue of power, a fundamental conviction on the part of white Christians that they must always be in charge. This was evident from the beginning of the mission. William Shepherd had been petitioning for years to be sent to Congo, but the PCUS refused his plea until they could find a white man to lead the mission. After Lapsley's death, Shepherd ran the mission, to the considerable discomfort of the sending church. When the Edmistons sought to return to Congo in 1911, there was a long delay because the PCUS was determined to find, quote, 6 first-class people, that is, white missionaries. They were obviously trying to limit African Americans to accommodate Belgian prejudices. When the white missionary David Snyder needed to return to the U.S. for health reasons, the PCUS refused to allow this until they could find a white man to replace him, since African Americans could not be left in charge. When local mission assignments were made, the whites were placed in proximity to the Belgians to represent the church, while the African Americans were sent to outlying stations. When Althea Brown Edmiston fought for her Bakuba grammar and dictionary, she was obliged to wait 20 years and find her own subsidies for publication because white missionaries had concluded that they only needed Chaluba and were not interested in Edmiston's linguistic studies. African Americans also suffered under the moral paternalism of the white church and their white colleagues, particularly the determination to control the African Americans' sexual behavior. Despite high praise for Shepherd's many gifts as a linguist and his ability to open new doors for the gospel, his white colleagues were much concerned about his earlier marital infidelity. This had been known for some time, but it was only after the big public triumph of the international trial that it was brought forward in a new way. Shepherd himself fully recognized his sin and accepted the year-long suspension of his ministry when he was forced to return to the U.S. But the timing of the enforced resignation suggests that his prominence was as much a problem for the white leaders as his behavior. The one exception to the Belgian rule of no new African American missionaries was the coming of Miss Edna May Atkinson, the second Mrs. Rochester, to assure that the widower was safely remarried, although he had managed quite well alone for more than 8 years. Much of this paternalism was the consequence of the sending church attitudes, and there were a significant number of more respectful personal relations among white and African American missionaries. But many white missionaries certainly played a very real part, as when William Morrison engineered Shepherd's resignation. The climate of racism in the United States and the PCUS was an important factor in attitudes toward the appointment of African American missionaries. Remember, this is the era of Jim Crow and lynchings. Having fully established the principle that white missionaries must be in charge, the PCUS accepted a number of African Americans to be appointed in the first 20 years of the APCM. One reason was that it seemed that those of African heritage could better withstand the tropical climate. However, the standards for admitting African Americans to the mission field were somewhat contradictory. White leadership was uneasy with classically trained Fisk graduates like Althea Brown, but they also excluded older or less well-educated African American applicants like Mariah Fearing. Miss Fearing financed her own way, established a ministry to girls, and learned the language. The American authorities conceded that she was functioning as a missionary, but it still required some time before they recognized this with a salary that a white single woman would receive. Skin color outweighed education. To maintain a white male leadership, the PCUS was willing to send a young and completely unqualified man, Samuel Phillips Verner, to replace DeWitt Snyder so that the latter could go on furlough. Verner was a disaster and soon left the mission. A few examples of African American experience in the American church may be added. A newspaper report in 1906 describes the problem Althea Brown encountered in trying to get to Congo. To get PCUS sponsorship, she had to join that church, and a Nashville congregation agreed to admit her to membership. However, its whites-only policy meant that Brown could not enter the Sunday service or sanctuary, but had to be sneaked into a Thursday prayer meeting. When Shepherd traveled to speak at white churches about the mission work, the white congregation would listen, but when they sat down to eat, the speaker was sent to take his meal in the kitchen with the servants. Shepherd's continued ministry in the Presbyterian Church after his return from Africa passed without any particular notice by the leadership. When he published the story of his early years in Congo, it was presented as led by Lapsley. The American church editor was not interested in the remarkable feats of the mature Shepherd and his international recognition by European intellectuals. Thus far, the focus has been on Americans of both white and African heritage. It is important to say something about the relationships with Congolese, although I am deliberately limiting this section because my colleague, Professor Simon Kabwembala, will be treating it. White paternalism toward Congolese came naturally. Some of the American cultural attitudes, such as Victorian ideas of dress, were shared by the African American missionaries. Photos of the period show this clearly. For Miss Fearing's students from Pantop's house, it was a matter of pride that they were well dressed, wearing far more than was traditional. Shepherd praised the Kuba because of their dress, so different from the nakedness of other tribes. Some attitudes toward Congolese were different among the various American missionaries. For example, on the subject of training Congolese for church leadership, with whites often against and African Americans usually for. The common racist language of the Old South continued in the language that people used. The Congolese servants in missionaries' homes were called boys, even when they were older than the missionaries. Part 3. By the mid-20th century, some attitudes were changing, however. Evidence of one sort is found in the return of African American missionaries to the Presbyterian work in Congo, beginning in 1958 with Miss Betty Jean Mitchell, and later the Barnes family and the Reverend Morrisine Flannel Mucci. Another significant mark of the new was the attitudes of white missionaries of the post-World War II generation, who rejected in many ways the earlier paternalism. This was often especially true of those who had been born and reared in Congo, for whom Chulubu or Chiketi or some other language was their first language as much as English, for whom Congolese Christians were the overwhelming majority of their Christian world as they were growing up, for whom Congolese were becoming respected colleagues and might well be their best friends. Here I'm going to take the privilege of the speaker to share a story about my father, Ngulamingi Wantalisha, Charles McKee, whose best friend for more than 45 years was Pastor Kabea Paul. My mother told me this story, which happened when we lived at Kankinda, where both of my parents were teaching. One evening when I was probably about 5, we had a number of Congolese guests, students of my parents, for supper, and a Belgian visitor was present. After supper, Mother sent us to bed, but first we went around the circle of guests and kissed each one good night, to the great shock of the Belgian. I do not remember this. It was obviously not the first or the last time it happened. I was simply doing the usual thing. There was no distinction between black and white in the house of Ngulamingi Wantalisha.